Imagine you are lying in a reinforced concrete bunker on the French coast. Here is the deadliest weapon of the Second World War, the MG-42 machine gun, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Through the embrasure, you can see endless waves of soldiers running out of amphibious boats right into the icy water. Your finger is on the trigger. You know, today, either you kill hundreds of people, or they kill you. There is no third option. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, the largest military operation in the history of mankind, is turning into a bloodbath. German machine gunners using MG-42 mow down Americans by the hundreds. The water turns red, the sand is littered with bodies. In the first few minutes, one company loses 90% of its personnel. Bullets cut through the air at such a speed that they create a continuous roar, similar to a torn canvas. American soldiers call it Hitler's circular saw, but by noon, everything changes. American assault groups are beginning to methodically destroy the nests of resistance one by one. Grenades explode inside bunkers. Flamethrowers turn reinforced concrete boxes into furnaces. And those machine gunners who survive and surrender, what happened to them next is a story that they preferred not to document. The story of the reckoning for every comrade killed. The story of how the most formidable weapon of war became a curse for those who stood behind it. Sand fortresses. The German command was well aware that sooner or later the Allies would try to land on the coast of France. And we've been preparing for this day for years. Thousands of fortified positions were built along the entire Atlantic coast, the so-called nests of resistance. These were not just trenches or trenches. These were real reinforced concrete fortresses with meter-high walls capable of withstanding a direct hit by a ship's projectile. In the center of each such nest was an MG-42 machine gun, which forever changed the nature of war. Its rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute was twice as high as that of any Allied machine gun. The German soldiers called him Hitler's saw. The Americans nicknamed him Hitler's circular saw. When the MG-42 opened fire, the individual shots merged into one continuous roar, similar to the work of an industrial machine. Each machine gun crew consisted of 3 men. The gunner, the most experienced soldier, who controlled the fire and selected targets. The gunner's assistant changed the barrels when they overheated from continuous firing and monitored the supply of cartridges. The third member of the crew carried ammunition, which was the hardest job, considering that one machine gun could consume up to 12,000 rounds per battle. Their task was extremely simple and absolutely ruthless: to keep shooting until the beach was cleared of enemies or until they themselves died behind a machine gun. There was no third option. The German command spoke bluntly: your position will be held until the last man and the last round. Training of Allies. The Allies were not naive. For months, aerial reconnaissance of the entire Normandy coast was conducted. Photographers on reconnaissance planes took thousands of pictures, which were then carefully studied by analysts. Every bunker, every firing point was mapped in detail. British and American intelligence knew the location of almost all German fortifications. The plan was developed with mathematical precision. First, a massive aerial bombardment. Hundreds of heavy bombers were supposed to turn the German positions into a moonscape. Then the naval artillery, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were supposed to drop thousands of tons of shells onto the shore. And only after that, the infantry landed, which was supposed to simply clean up the ruins. In theory, everything looked perfect. In practice, everything went catastrophically wrong. The bombers, fearing anti-aircraft fire and poor visibility, dropped most of the bombs too far from the coast, into fields and villages where there were no German troops. The naval bombardment, although impressive in scale, proved to be insufficiently accurate. Shells exploded everywhere: in front of the bunkers, behind the bunkers, next to the bunkers. But the meter-thick reinforced concrete walls could withstand even direct hits. When the first waves of troops began to approach the shore, many of the resistance nests remained fully functional. The MG-42 machine gunners sat in their bunkers, listened to the roar of the bombing and waited. They knew that the real work would begin soon. The American command understood that the infantry needed the support of armored vehicles right on the beach. For this purpose, special DD duplex drive Sherman floating tanks were developed with a canvas screen that allowed the tank to stay afloat. The idea was ingenious in theory. Tanks land a few kilometers from the shore, swim to the beach on their own, and provide fire support to the infantry. The British and Canadians also used Hobart tanks on their landing sites. Tanks with chains for mine clearance. Tanks with bridges to overcome anti-tank trenches. Flamethrower tanks for burning bunkers. This technique proved to be a lifesaver on British beaches. But the Americans on Omaha decided to make do with mostly floating Shermans. And then disaster struck. The sea that morning was much more choppy than expected. The waves reached 1.5 meters. This would be tolerable for an ordinary ship, but deadly for a tank with a canvas screen. Of the 32 tanks launched from the amphibious ships, 27 sank. They just sank to the bottom, turning into metal coffins for their crews. Only 5 tanks reached the shore. The infantry found themselves with virtually no support. The soldiers faced a task that bordered on suicide: to storm fortified concrete bunkers with MG-42 machine guns, with only small arms, grenades and desperate courage. How did the MG-42 calculations work? The German machine gunners were not only well-trained, they were professionals in the deadly craft. The years of war on the Eastern Front taught them tactics that maximized the effectiveness of fire and created the maximum psychological effect. The basic tactic was called mowing the grass. The gunner did not aim at the center of mass, but low, at knee or hip level. Why? A wounded soldier creates more problems for the attackers than a dead one. He screams, distracting his comrades. Doctors and friends rush to him, creating new goals. It blocks passages between obstacles. One wounded soldier could incapacitate 3 or 4 people who were trying to help him. Experienced gunners used psychological tricks. For example, long bursts of tracer bullets were fired just above the heads of the attacking soldiers. This created the illusion that the shooter was panicking and couldn't aim. The Americans thought they had a chance, rose to their full height, ran forward, and then the gunner lowered the barrel and opened real fire to kill. Another tactic is the reverse mower. Instead of firing from left to right, which is natural for right-handers, the gunner moved the barrel from right to left. The soldiers instinctively tried to anticipate the direction of the fire and dodge, but they fell right under the bullets moving in an unexpected direction. The MG-42 was so fast-firing that it could literally cut a man in half at close range. The cues were so dense that they created visible corridors of death in the air from tracer bullets. Entering such a corridor meant instant death. Hell on Omaha Beach, the early hours. When the landing boat ramps lowered and the first American soldiers ran out into the icy water, they found themselves in a nightmare that surpassed any training simulation. Army medic Ray Lambert recalled, "I saw how bullets literally cut through the water around us. The water was churning as if someone had turned on a giant mixer. And then these bullets started hitting people. The guys fell one by one, the water turned red." In the Dog Green sector, Company A of the 116th Regiment lost almost 90% of its personnel in the first 10 minutes. 90%. Company Commander Captain Taylor Fellers died as soon as he stepped into the water. His body was then found on the shore with 21 bullet wounds. The soldiers who survived in the water found themselves pinned to the shore, unable to move forward or back. German machine gunner Heinrich Sevelow took up a position in the resistance bunker Nest 62 on a hill with an ideal view of the beach. When he opened fire on the first wave of troops, his MG-42 was operating almost continuously. In a few hours of combat, he fired about 12,000 rounds, which means that his machine gun fired almost non-stop, mowing down people like wheat. His assistant gunner was constantly changing the overheating barrels. The MG-42 had an ingenious design. The barrel could be changed in 5 seconds by simply opening the bolt carrier. But even at this rate of change, the barrels were red hot. The bunker smelled of hot metal and gunpowder, and the temperature was rising to unbearable. An American officer who was watching the massacre from a ship radioed, "This is not a landing. This is a mass murder." But even in this hell, there were people whose courage bordered on madness. Small groups of soldiers, realizing that staying on the beach meant certain death, began to move forward. Sergeant John Robertson crawled with a group of 5 men to the WN-61 firing point. They moved from crater to crater, from body to body, using any cover. A German machine gun fired over their heads, mowing down the next waves of troops. Robert knew that every second of delay meant dozens of lives. They reached the dead zone directly under the bunker, a place where the machine gun could not fire due to the angle of inclination. Robertson pulled out the grenades and prepared to throw them into the embrasure. But at that moment, a German rifle poked out of the bunker and fired almost point blank. The bullet hit the sergeant in the shoulder. He threw the grenade anyway. Explosion. The firing from the bunker stopped. Such scenes were repeated all along the beach. Rangers and engineers crawled up to the bunkers under fire, laying explosives in the air vents. Flamethrowers, despite being priority targets for the Germans, broke through to the embrasures and burned out the insides of the bunkers. Colonel George Taylor, a brigadier general who landed with the first waves, uttered a phrase that has become legendary: "There are only 2 types of people on the beach here, the dead and those who are going to die. So let's get the hell out of here." By noon, the situation began to change. American assault groups methodically destroyed one nest of resistance after another. Engineers blew up the bunkers from the inside. The tanks, which finally reached the shore, began shooting at the embrasures with direct fire. The German defenses, which seemed impenetrable, began to crumble. The fate of machine gunners. Heinrich Sevelow, the same machine gunner who fired 12,000 rounds at the Americans, found himself in a desperate situation by noon. His assistant was killed by a tank shell. Ammunition was running out. The bunker was damaged, and concrete dust and smoke made it difficult to breathe. There were shouts in English from outside as the Americans surrounded the position. He did what many German machine gunners did that day. He raised his hands and surrendered. He later recalled, "I expected to be killed on the spot. I would have no moral right to complain. I've just killed an unknown number of their comrades. But the American sergeant just searched me, took my weapon and sent me to the rear under escort. I couldn't believe I was still alive." Not all machine gunners were so lucky. There is numerous, albeit unofficial, evidence that MG-42 crews captured immediately after the battle sometimes did not live to see the prisoner of war camps. These incidents were rarely documented. One American veteran confessed years later, "When you see your friends, with whom you have been training for months, fall into the water, cut in half by bullets. When you hear their screams. And then you get to the bunker and you see the German who just did it." It is very difficult to recall the Geneva Convention. The psychological burden on the machine gunners was enormous. They knew that they were the #1 priority targets. They knew that if they were captured, there was little chance of mercy. Some preferred to continue fighting to the end, even when the position became hopeless, not out of fanaticism, but out of fear of what would happen if they surrendered. Heinrich Sevelow survived the war and returned to Germany. But Omaha Beach never let him go. For decades, he was haunted by nightmares, faces in the sights, falling bodies, the endless rumble of MG-42. In the 1960s, he did something unusual. He started looking for the families of dead American soldiers. Through veterans organizations, he contacted relatives of people who may have died from his bullets. He wrote letters asking for forgiveness, trying to explain the inexplicable. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the landing, Sevelow met with David Silver, an American veteran who stormed his part of the beach and was injured. The meeting was intense. Silver brought photos of his dead comrades. Sevelow cried looking at them. They talked for hours, two old soldiers, on opposite sides of the most terrible battle. Silver later told reporters, "I have not forgiven him. Forgiveness is not the right word. But I realized that he was a soldier just like me, just on the other side. The war has made us both murderers and victims at the same time." The Atlantic Wall bunkers are still standing. Tourists walk along the beaches of Normandy, peering into the dark embrasures, trying to imagine what people saw and felt on both sides of the concrete. Traces of fire and bullet marks are still visible inside some bunkers. Cinema has brought the MG-42 sound to new generations. Steven Spielberg's film Saving Private Ryan showed with its brutal realism what the real D-Day was like. The distinctive sound of the circular saw has become as much a part of the cultural memory of the war as the howl of dive bombers. MG-42 survived the Third Reich. In modified versions, it is still in service with the German army as the MG-3. The design turned out to be so successful that more than 80 years later, engineers could not create anything significantly better. Friends, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like it.